Hello everyone, welcome to my lecture. SQL injection and buffer overflows are hacking techniques used to exploit weaknesses in applications. When programs are written, some parameter used in the creation of the application's code can leave weaknesses in the program. SQL injection and buffer overflows are covered in the same lecture because they both are methods used to attack application and are generally caused by programming flaws. Generally, the purpose of SQL injection is to convince the application to run SQL code that was not intended. SQL injection is a hacking method used to attack SQL databases, whereas buffer overflows can exist in many different types of application. SQL injection and buffer overflows are similar exploits in that they are both usually delivered via a user input field. The input field is where a user may enter a username and password on a website, add data to a URL, or perform a search for a keyword in another application. The SQL injection vulnerability is caused primarily by unverified or unsanitized user input via these fields. Both SQL Server injection and buffer overflow vulnerabilities are caused by the same issue: invalid parameters that are not verified by the application. If programs don't take the time to validate the variables a user can enter into a variable field, the results can be serious and unpredictable. Sophisticated hackers can exploit this vulnerability, causing an execution fault and shutdown of the system or application, or a command shell to be executed for the hacker. SQL injection and buffer overflow countermeasures are designed to utilize secure programming methods. By changing the variables used by the application code, weaknesses in application can be greatly minimized. As a CAH, it's important for you to be able to define SQL injection and understand the steps a hacker takes to conduct a SQL injection attack. In addition, you should know SQL Server vulnerabilities as well as countermeasures to SQL injection attacks. SQL injection. SQL injection occurs when an application processes use provided data to create a SQL statement without first validating the input. The user input is then submitted to a web application database server for execution. When successfully exploited, SQL injection can give an attacker access to database content or allow the hacker to remotely execute system commands. In the worst case scenario, the hacker can take control of the server that is hosting the database. The exploit can give a hacker to a remote shell into the server file system. The impact of a SQL injection attack depends on where the vulnerability is in the code, how easy it is to exploit the vulnerability, and what level of access the application has to the database. Theoretically, SQL injection can occur in any type of application, but it is most commonly associated with web application because they are most often attacked. As previously discussed, web hacking, Google web servers, web application vulnerabilities, and web-based password cracking techniques. Web applications are easy target because they, by their very nature, they are open to being accessed from the internet. You should have a basic understanding of how databases work and how SQL commands are used to access the information in the databases prior to attempting the CEH exam. During a web application SQL injection attack, malicious code is inserted into a web from field or the website's code to make a system execute a command shell or other arbitrary commands, just as a legitimate user enters queries and addition to the SQL database via a web form. The hacker can insert commands to the SQL server through the same web from field. For example, an arbitrary command from a hacker might open a command prompt or display a table from the database. A database table may contain personal information such as credit card numbers, social security numbers, or passwords. SQL servers are very common database servers and used by many organizations to store confidential data. This makes a SQL server a high value target and therefore a system that is very attractive to hackers. Determining SQL injection vulnerabilities. While performing a black hat penetration test on a corporate network, a security tester Tom found a custom application on one of the publicly accessible web servers. Since this was a black hat test, Tom did not have access to the source code to see how the program had been created, but after performing some information gathering, he was able to determine that the server was running Microsoft Internet Information Server 6 along with ASP.NET, and this suggested that the database was Microsoft SQL Server. The login page of the web application had a username, a password field, and a forgotten password link, which ended up being the easiest way into the system. A forgotten password link works by looking in the user database for the user's email address and sending an email containing the password to that address. So, to determine if the forgotten password link was vulnerable to SQL injection, Tom entered a single quote as part of the data is the forgotten password field. The purpose was to see if the application would construct a SQL string literally without sanitizing the user input. When submitting the form with a quota in the email address, he received a 500 error, and this suggested that the user input was being parsed literally. Finding a SQL injection vulnerability. Before launching a SQL injection attack, the hacker determines whether the configuration of the database and related tables and variables is vulnerable. The steps to determine the SQL server's vulnerability are as follows. Using your web browser, search for a website that uses a login page or other database input or query fields. Look for web pages that display the post or get HTML commands by checking the site source code. 2. Test the SQL server using single quotes. Doing so indicates whether the user input variable is sanitized or interpreted literally by the server. If the server responds with an error message that says use a is equal to a or something similar, then it's most likely susceptible to a SQL injection attack. Use the select command to retrieve data from the database or the insert command to add information to the database. These commands and similar variation may allow a user to bypass a login depending on the structure of the database. When entered in a form field, the commands may return many rows in a table or even an entire database table because the SQL server is interpreting the terms literally. The double dashes near the end of the command tell SQL to ignore the rest of the command as a comment. SQL injection attacks are used by hackers to achieve certain results. Some SQL exploits will produce valuable user data stored in the database, and some are just precursors to other attacks.